Okay, so we are now going to we're going to get into plants in more detail now. So we reviewed all of these sort of grade 10 stuff. Now we're going to expand upon that. We looked at the leaf as an organ and the flower. But now we're going to look at plant tissues and organs and things, in particular the systems that they have in a little more detail. I'm going to draw a few pictures and get to know plants. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to put page 545 here because there's a beautiful picture of a plant cell on that page. We've already discussed plant cells, but you should be familiar with plant cell, the typical plant cell, and some of the things that make it special. In particular, we talked about obviously the chlorophyll that they possess, but also the large vacuole, which helps to maintain the pressure, the water pressure inside plant cells. And we also talked about the cell wall a little bit. Okay, now here's some of the new stuff. Plant cells come in three basic types. Three basic types. So we'll just kind of make a little list and sort of what each type does. So the first type is called the Parenchyma cells. I'll write this nice and clear. Parenchyma. These cells are found all over the place. They function as storage cells, storage of things like sugars and nutrients. They are often involved in photosynthesis. Remember how we said that although all the plant cells have the chlorophyll, or most of them have chlorophyll in them, some of them are more highly specialized for different purposes. So some are specifically specialized to be photosynthesis machines, and so that's a special thing. Gas exchange. They function as protective tissues, or I'll just put protection, and tissue repair. So they do a lot of things, repair and growth and replacement and so on. Parenchyma cells. The vast majority of the cells inside the leaf, in the middle part of the leaf, are parenchyma cells. Okay. I think we actually labeled that, the parenchyma, on our last video. All right, the next type is the Collechyma. So maybe I'll put a line there. And these types of cells are slightly different. They're basically support structures. Support for surrounding tissues. So as we're going to see, there are some cells that actually help other cells out. Whoops. I'm talking and writing at the same time. Support for surrounding tissues. Some cells in animals and plants are so specialized that they can't continue to operate on their own. They need help from another cell. They've given up so many of the jobs of life that they require another cell to sort of hang out with them to help them out. What they tend to do is they tend to provide flexibility. We'll see that these things are often found in stems, allowing the stems to blow and twist and be flexible. And they are also involved in tissue repair and replacement. So you'll see how there's a lot of overlap, right? There's a lot of overlap in what they do, but they each have a sort of a different role, as we'll see. We'll see it in detail as we go through them. And then lastly, We have the Sclerenchyma. And the Sclerenchyma cells basically are to, they support the mature plant. Okay, they have a very strong cell wall, very rigid, thick cell wall. So Sclerenchyma cells are often found wherever we need thick support, like think about trees and things. And what happens is these Sclerenchyma, they often die. Remember we talked about the xylem tissue, how it dies to make it, so we're going to talk more about that later. But Sclerenchyma often dies as a, once it's reached its mature state, and it basically is a support structure, like a beam or a tube or whatever. So that's the different types of cells. Okay, and just to review, we also talked about plant tissues. So those types of cells are found in different plant tissues. And so we remembered there was the dermal tissue. We already wrote this in our last video. There was the ground tissue and the vascular tissue. But there's also something new we're going to add to this. It's called meristematic. There's a big word. Tissue. Now, meristematic tissue is, we don't often mention it because these three tissues over here are sort of specialized tissues. Meristematic tissue is tissue that's unspecialized. It's kind of like stem cells. Meristematic tissue is unspecialized tissue or cells. And what it does is it basically it grows rapidly. So anytime you have a place in a plant where there's rapid growth, you're going to see this meristematic tissue. A region that has a meristematic tissue is called a meristem. So, and it's a region of rapid growth. So the place we find meristems are places where plants are growing rapidly. So for instance, the root tip, the tip of a root has a meristem because it's growing very quickly. It has to continuously grow and reach out through the soil. You'll find them in the stem of plants that grow. Root tips, stems, and they can make the plant grow either longer or they can make the plant grow wider. Kind of the same idea. So this meristematic tissue is an addition to what we had done in grade 10. Okay. There are all kinds of different meristems. Some are designed for growing wider, some are designed for growing longer. We're not going to get into the details of that too much. So we're just going to add this in as a rapidly growing section. And as we go through the different organs and tissues, we'll see where they basically function. And as far as dermal tissue goes, we've pretty much talked about that as much as we need to. Remember the epidermis of the leaf, the guard cells. Dermal tissue also has many different dermal tissue cells have special little projections that they grow. That could be for all kinds of reasons, like roots have tiny hairs that grow out of them. So the outside layer of the root is a dermal tissue, and it has tiny hairs that extend to help with the absorption of things. And there's all kinds of additions like that. But we are going to talk in more detail about, well, the ground tissue we've kind of talked about a fair bit as well. But the vascular tissue, I want to go into more detail on. Remember, the ground tissue are the photosynthetic cells and the cells that are sort of on the inside. In the leaf, most of the inner part of it, between the two epidermi are the ground tissue cells. But let's talk about xylem and phloem in a little more detail. So first of all, let's talk about xylem and how it works. And so xylem is actually made up of cells that, what they do is, there's two kinds. There are what we call tracheids and vessel elements. They both are kind of the same idea, but they're just slightly different in terms of their structure. Tracheids and vessel elements. So we'll draw a picture to give us an idea. So what a tracheid and a vessel cell element are. Let's do the tracheids first. The tracheid is a cell. I'm going to get a thinner line here. And the cell grows into a long sort of tube-like shape. And then we're going to go like this. Something like that. And then the next cell, which I'll just draw in a different color so we can see the two together, sort of wraps up against it like this. So it has this sort of slanted joining area between the two cells. But then what happens is that the part in here either develops holes or sometimes completely dissolves altogether. And so there's now space between there. And the spaces allow for the movement of water. And so water can move freely through these vessels up and down without any trouble. And of course, these vessels have died. They have stopped living. They don't require to be alive. They're essentially a cell wall, right? That structure is the cell wall, the rigid cell wall. And once it has grown and done its job, it dies. So this is what we call a vessel element. And of course, or sorry, this is what we call a tracheid, my mistake. And the tracheid is identified by the way it joins here. The vessel element joins slightly differently. So I'll put a line here. The vessel element is basically tubes that sort of join like this. But the next cell, maybe I'll do the next cell in red, the next cell joins up with it, but you'll notice that what happens is the cell wall in between them dissolves completely, and it leaves like a tube shape, and then the next cell would sort of come down here, and so on. And so you get a sort of a flat joining here, instead of the twisty joining. So in the tracheid, the cells are sort of wrapped, almost like in a bit of a spiral, whereas here they're just sort of end to end, and they form these long tubes, and these tubes allow, of course, water to move. And we're going to talk about how that water moves in more detail later on. So that's what xylem actually looks like. And don't forget, xylem is dead. Once the cells grow and mature, they die and leave behind these huge tubes of cell wall, essentially. Wood is mostly xylem tissue. Dead tubes. And you can see how much wood is in, like a tree, for instance. A tree is mostly, the stem of it, is mostly a bunch of tubes all linked together. And of course, if you did it in cross-section, right? If you looked at the top of this as a circle, in cross-section then, what wood is it's a whole bunch of tubes that run like this all together in bundles, and they go up and down the tree trunk. Coming out towards you could be the top of the tree and going in the bottom. And that's what mostly a trunk of a tree is. It's all just water tubes. So the water, a tremendous amount of water has to be moved up from the roots to get to the leaves. Because remember, photosynthesis requires water, right? It's carbon dioxide plus water that eventually becomes glucose. Now, the phloem is slightly different. You can see some pictures of this too on 549 if you're following along. Better pictures than what we're drawing, but we draw the pictures to help us memorize and learn, right? So the phloem cells are slightly different. The phloem is for the transport of sugars, right? Hi, sure. All right, so the transporting of sugars. It's still done as a fluid, right? But it's a slightly different mechanism, and we're going to see in detail how it works. So the phloem is made of two specialized kinds of cells as well, and these are called sieve tube elements. Sieve tube elements and companion cells. Okay, phloem is alive. It is not dead. These cells have to be alive because in order to move the sugar, the plant relies on what's active transport. Remember we talked about transport way back? It requires energy, and it has to move the sugar with active transport. Well, if something requires energy, then it has to be alive in order to put that energy in, right? And so these cells are actually alive. So what happens here, they do form tubes, kind of like the xylem. So they form a sort of a tube. But at the bottom, instead of a big hole that opens up, what you get is if you were to look at this sort of on the inside and see how the round part would look, there are all these little holes in it. And then the next cell joins up, and then the same thing would happen. So what we have here is this little sort of thing which is called a sieve plate, formed from the membranes and the cell walls that have attached. But instead of just dissolving away and forming a tube, there are these tiny, tiny little holes in here. And so that allows for the movement of sugars, water with sugars, to be moved through from one to the other, right? But it doesn't just kind of just go like through a pipe. It has to be sort of kind of pushed along through there, as we'll see. So you've got the sieve plate between the two sieve tube elements. So the sieve tube elements are these tube-like things, these cells. And then what happens is there's another cell that lives right beside it. And it's got a nucleus, and it's alive as well. The sieve tube elements, they're alive. They're still living cells, but they have lost a lot of their ability to do things because they're so highly specialized. And so they need a companion cell living beside them to help with the jobs of life that they have given up. Companion cell. So the living sieve tube element it can only do certain things. It's kind of like if you recall red blood cells. They've given up everything. They don't even have a nucleus. And they run around in the bloodstream transporting oxygen. But they only last a couple of days and then they die, and they have to be regenerated by the bone marrow. They're very specialized. But they're still alive. They're still living cells. These companion cells are providing support for the phloem. So that's the two sort of mechanisms, or the two sort of structures, I guess you could say, of how the xylem is set up. The xylem is essentially just tubes, whereas the phloem is living cells end to end with a special sieve plate in between them that allows for the movement of things. And we'll get into some of those details of how that works a little bit later. Okay, so we've covered a little more detail on the vascular tissue here, and a little more detail. We introduced the meristems and the meristematic tissue. Now we're going to look at some of the other organs that we haven't yet, that are easier to describe now that we understand all this. So let's move down. We've already looked at the leaf. Whoops. We've already looked at the leaf, so done. And we've already looked at the flower, so done. But what we haven't yet looked at are the roots and the stems. So let's take a quick look at roots, first of all, how roots are set up. Typically, what a root does, if we draw a little picture here. So let's take, I guess black is a good color. Why does that keep jumping? Black. Oh, come on, don't do that. All I want to do is press this. Nope. Done. Let's go back, try again. There we go. Okay. If you look at a root sort of macroscopically, it looks like a long tube that extends outward from the plant, right? Thinner and thinner and thinner as it grows. And it typically has extensions that come out of the root hairs. Come out like this. And these root hairs help increase the surface area. Do you remember the villi of the intestine? The tiny finger-like projections. Those increase the surface area for absorption, and this also increases the surface area. It's a totally different thing, but it's the same idea. It's absorbing stuff from the ground, and so the root hairs allow for a greater surface area. So what we're going to do now is we're going to sort of take a cross-section. We're going to slice this root and look at what it looks like sort of on the inside in cross-section. And we can see that it basically has an outer layer of cells like this, sort of a dermal cells that form sort of the outside of it. I'm going to go all the way around here. There's the outside skin, so to speak, of the root. And of course, these outside epidermal cells often grow these extensions, which become the root hairs. So we can just draw a couple of little hairy things coming out like that. Root hair extensions. There, something like that. All right. Then there's a layer of ground tissue. So black is the dermal tissue. Let's go green for the ground tissue. There's not really a whole lot of photosynthetic action happening in roots because they're underground. So they don't really have a lot of chlorophyll in them, and they don't look green. They look kind of pale whitish or brownish. So actually, you know what I'll do is I'll pick a different color. I'll pick this pale or this orangey color instead. Because green, we always think, oh, photosynthesis, right? That's not really the function of roots under the ground. So then we have sort of a layer of cells in here. So we'll draw a bunch of cells all around. Like that. This is called the cortex. Cortex. And there'll be relatively thick layer, something like that. There, the cortex. So we'll label it all in a minute. This is mostly ground tissue. It's mostly parenchyma cells, and they transport water, things like that. So in other words, everything that comes into the root comes in through the epidermis and is sort of absorbed or transferred into the cortex. So in order to get into the actual vascular tissue, which is at the center of the root, you have to go through the cortex. And we'll talk about why that's important in a minute. Okay, then we have a little layer. There's another dermal layer. It's an endodermal layer because it's inside instead of outside. So let's do another black here. And there's just a sort of a very thin layer, like this. But this layer has a very special characteristic, this endodermal layer. Each of these cells, now this is going to be difficult to draw, so now I'm going to take another color. Let's use maybe something like purple. Wrapped around these cells, okay, wrapped all around these cells is a waterproof material, right? I'm going to sort of draw it like this. And over here, I'm going to draw what that actually looks like. The cell is wrapped like this with this waterproofing layer that goes all around each cell. Think of it like, in your bathtub where you have to seal off the cracks, like you have caulking all along the places where the cracks go, or on your windows because you don't want anything going in or out. This is kind of like caulking around the cells of this layer. And we'll write it down here. So it's called the Casparian strip, named after, I think, the person who developed it. And its purpose is to make sure that the area around the cells is sealed and waterproof. So it's a waterproofing strip, which is quite interesting because it's the whole point of waterproof. The whole point of the root is to let water in. But the waterproofing strip is necessary. Waterproofing strip. It's necessary because, don't forget, the way cells work. Let me just draw another picture here to show you this. The way cells work is cells, we often draw them like this, touching each other, right? But we have to remember that there is a space between them. So if you get down on the magic school bus, you have this big cell right here, and there's a space called the intercellular space, right? And there's fluid in that space and liquid. So essentially, if water was going to enter the root, the water could enter in two ways. The water could diffuse through the cells and make its way through like this. But the water could also leak in between the cells and not pass through the cells at all. But the plant wants total control over this water. And so the Casparian strip wraps in here like this and prevents any water from moving between the cells. It only forces water to go through the membranes and right through the cells so that they don't get bypassed. And that's an important thing because these cells have to be able to control the rates at which water moves in and out and the movement of minerals and things. And if you're letting it slip in between, it's like, the cells can't control it. Okay? So that's what's going on there. And then you have this middle part that we haven't filled in yet. So the middle part is the actual vascular tissue. Okay? So the middle part is the actual vascular tissue. And it's usually arranged in different ways depending on the type of plant. But it has both xylem and phloem inside. So what I'll do for now is in red, whoops, I'll write in some, come on. There we go. Some circles of red. Right? Like this. I'm going to cheat. Then I'm going to erase because I didn't leave room. And then I'll put a ring of blue for the xylem tissues. The xylem. And that's the xylem and the phloem. And they're arranged in different ways. In some plants, they're arranged where the xylem is like in a ring and the phloem is all around it. You can actually help identify and classify plants by the different shapes that the vascular tissue takes inside of roots and stems. And so we'll see that when we get into plant classification much later on in the course. But for now, that's the xylem tissue. So I guess we need some labels on this, right? So let's draw some lines. I'm going to label in green. That should stand out pretty well. So we have the epidermal layer on the outside. So maybe I can just erase this this big root here and get that out of the way. We don't really need him anyway. All right, back to green. So we have the epidermis. Which is a kind of dermal tissue. right? Then we have the region inside, which is called the cortex. So that's the brownish layer. Then we have the endodermis. Endodermis with the Casparian strip. So that would go right here to this black layer right there. And then we have the vascular tissue, which is the xylem and phloem, in the center. In there. All right. I'm going to let you catch up to me with the list. So that's how a root looks. We should mention that there's two different sort of types of roots. Types of roots. There's typically what we call a tap root. And a tap root is usually a very thick root. A very thick, that says thick root. And then it has lateral branches on it. And usually the taproot grows straight down. So if you have a tree here, there's the tree. At the bottom, the taproot will grow straight down and it'll be a very thick root deep into the ground. And then it has these little branches that will grow off of it. The taproot is often used to store food. It stores starches. The starches are made from sugar from photosynthesis, right? So the plant is up, the leaves are up there doing their thing, and they're making the sugar. That says starches, but it should say starches. There we go. The leaves are doing their thing, making all these sugars, and the sugars are being assembled into bigger starch molecules for storage for later. And then what happens is those sugars are pumped down into the root system, where they basically grow, or they basically are stored inside this taproot. The taproot is basically what we eat when we eat a carrot. A lot of vegetables have a big root. Now, of course, original carrots didn't have a taproot that big. We bred them on purpose to make them bigger and bigger and bigger. But still, the taproot of many plants is for storage of starches, and we've discovered that we can eat taproots. So there's lots of plants that have modified taproots, anything essentially that grows underground. So think of beets, and think of radishes, and think of carrots and potatoes and all of these things. Those are root structures that have been pumped full of starches for storage, and we make use of that by eating. The other, of course, primary source of this taproot, or primary, function, is it goes down deep into the ground. So it's going to ensure that there's water. It's looking for water. The deeper you go, the better chance of finding water on a regular basis. Trees have very large taproots that go very, well, most trees, I shouldn't say that, I should say some trees, have a very large taproot that goes down deep into the ground. So even if it doesn't rain for many, many, many days, or possibly weeks, that root is so far underground, it's still accessing water. Other trees don't have a deep taproot. They instead rely on a whole bunch of roots that go out over the surface, but then, of course, they're more dependent on rain, right? So the taproot is also deep and gives access to water. And then, of course, we have what are called fibrous roots. Fibrous roots. These are all the smaller sort of branching roots. And so smaller branches. These are often for anchoring the plant into the ground. I mean, they also, for all roots are for absorbing water, so we understand that's their function, but they also provide anchoring, and of course, H2O, water. So there's some pictures on page 554. You can see how the carrot taproot. Then they show another, looks like leeks there, little oniony leek things. And you can see how they have sort of a main sort of taproot, but they have these whole bunch of fibrous little roots sticking out of them, right? So if you go back to our tree example, you have your main taproot that comes down, and then you have all these other roots that branch off and go out like this. And the roots of a tree will extend many, many meters under the ground like this. And of course, that's part of the support system, because when the wind blows and the tree is pushed to one side, there's a tremendous amount of force pushing on the tree this way. All of these roots over here deep in the ground are anchoring it and preventing it from being ripped out of the ground. It takes a very strong wind to rip a tree out of the ground. Usually when that happens, it's because the tree is already old and starting to decay and its anchoring isn't as good. What's also amazing about roots, especially when we live here in the Canadian Shield, you can go into the bush and find Canadian Shield rock, right? So there's this big giant rock. And what happens is the tiny tree, I'm going to draw it in red, the tiny little sapling gets anchored there, and it begins to push its roots into the cracks of the rock. And the roots will grow into the cracks, and the pressure of the roots can actually crack the rock and break the rock apart. So as the roots grow into the rock to gain hold, the tree starts to grow and gets bigger, and eventually you'll find these huge trees, hundreds of feet in the air, and they have these immense roots that have tangled and weaved their way into the pure solid rock, and they're grabbing onto that rock, and it's almost like you wonder how they can live on this rock. But roots can crack rock. They're extreme. Anybody who knows, if you have a house with a tree too close to the house, the roots can crack the cement foundation of the house. They can try to grow right through and cause problems. So you got to be careful. If you ever build a house, there's a reason why we clear the trees away. Trees too close to the house, the big roots can go underneath and crack your basement. So you have to watch out for that. So that's roots. I think what we'll do is we'll pause, we'll take a break, and then we'll come back to this video and finish off with stems. Let's get into stems a little bit. Stems have a structure very similar to roots, because, plants, one nice thing about plants is they essentially have two major systems, and that's it. They have the root system underground, and then they have the shoot system on top of the ground. And these are the two basic systems that we describe in plants. So stems, typically, if you look at them in cross-section, rather than draw individual cells, they have like a dermal layer, and then of course they have vascular tissue inside there, and the arrangement of that can vary, again, depending on the plant. And then there's this substance in between, which I'll just kind of shade in with a crayon, which is typically called pith, P-I-T-H. And it's, let's see, what color here? How about this purple? No, how about this color? All this area in between. It's also made up of cells. All these are cellular structures. But these are the supporting cells that support the vascular tissue. There's two kinds of stems. There's what we call herbaceous stems. Herbaceous stems. These are soft green stems that you find on flowers, and you find them on lots of plants, right? But you think of soft stems. You could easily chew them. Plants, animals like to eat them. And then we have what are called woody stems. Woody stems are, of course, more like what you find on trees. They have a bark, and they're basically very hard. Typically, in perennial plants, which last many seasons, we see woody stems for support and protection. And then in plants that die every year, go to seed and then come back, or maybe not seed, but whatever they do to reproduce, we tend to find herbaceous stems. So like a fern has kind of a herbaceous stem, but not all ferns, right? Some ferns can develop more woody stems depending. The things like horsetails that you see in the summertime, most flowers have woody stems, or sorry, have herbaceous stems. I'm getting confused. But then you have trees and shrubs that last many seasons. They tend to have more woody stems. If we look at the way stems are sort of set up, especially the woody stems, they're kind of interesting. The picture I drew here is more like a herbaceous stem, but a woody stem, so think about a tree, for instance. A tree has an inner sort of layer, and what this is it's xylem tissue, but when the tree gets older, it's got another layer. So let me draw sort of, there's that wood, that layer. Then I'm going to draw another layer out here. And then there are some very thin layers that come next. So I'll take this red color and I'll draw a very thin layer like this. Then I'll take a blue color and draw another thin layer like this. And then I'll draw in a sort of dark color again, maybe the black again, another layer outside. It's not really to scale. This layer, these layers I've drawn are very thin. And we'll shade in some colors. So let's get our crayon. Let's pick a dark brown. The center here, this is called the heartwood. It's xylem tissue, but as the tree gets older, the next layer out is where most of the xylem is active. Over time, the tubes get plugged up in the heartwood with resins and saps and things, and they don't function anymore. They just basically are now there for, well, I guess you could say to support the tree. They also are a little bit, because they're filled with resins, that the resins are like sticky substances and saps that this tree secretes. It helps to preserve the tree as well, to keep things from, getting inside there, disease and whatnot. That's called the heartwood. We'll label it after once I'm finished coloring. Then we have this nice layer in here. This is called the sapwood. So this is also xylem. So it's dead tissue, right? Dead tubes. But this is most of the wood of the tree. And this is where the water is moving in and up, up and down the tree trunk. Okay. Then we have the red layer. The red layer, I'm not going to be able to shade anymore, but I'll just go back to my pen. Okay, so let's label the brown. The brown inner layer. I don't have brown color anymore. Where did it go? Right here, I think. Okay, okay. So we'll go out from here like this. That's the heartwood. And it's basically xylem tissue. But they're non-functioning anymore. For water transport, that is. Then I'll get my other brown color here. And we'll draw. I can't get this to listen to me. It's doing weird things today. Okay. There. So if we go in here, this is called the sapwood. So it's the younger xylem. So what's interesting is the growth is happening in this little layer on the outer part of the tree. So the growth is moving inwards. Xylem, as xylem grows, it's added in layers by the red, the red sort of ring of cells there. So the red ring of cells is called the cambium, the vascular cambium. And this is a ring of supporting cells, but it's also sort of where we find the growth. So this is where the cells are growing this way to make xylem, and they grow out this way, and they make the blue stuff, which is the phloem. you'll notice that the phloem is a very thin ring, and so is the vascular cambium, right? Very thin, thin layer. And then on the very outside, we have the bark, the cork part of the bark. Black cork. So together, the phloem and the cork form what's called the bark of the tree. So the cork is a tough outer protective part, like you find like on a maple tree or something. And then the phloem is just underneath the bark. And that phloem, of course, is transporting the sugars up and down. It's a very important tissue. And the vascular cambium is sort of in between the xylem and the phloem. And that's where, so the tree basically grows outward from the red line, inward towards the middle and outward from the red line. As it grows in, it makes more xylem. And it grows at different rates during the year. So it grows faster in the spring than it does in the winter or the late summer. And that's why we get different densities of tissue which form rings, right? We see inside here, there's a ringy texture to this. And the rings can be used to determine how many seasons the tree has been growing. Because the dense material represents slow growth. And the less dense material represents rapid growth, where the cells have grown more quickly. And so in between the rings is the spring growth. And then we get this ring structure. So if you count the rings, it gives you an idea of how many years old the tree is. And of course, that's all the xylem. So you got to be careful. If you cut into the tree, you don't have to cut very deep, just into the lower levels of the bark. You can damage the very important cambrium layer, which is where the growth is happening. Now, luckily, the tree is growing sort of out of the board here, and there's a whole lot of that wrapped all the way around. But when I was a kid, we used to go like to find birch trees, and you like to peel the birch bark off the trees because it was fun, and birch bark was cool, and you could do stuff with it, right? You found out very quickly that it burns very easily. Even if it's wet, it'll burn. If you're ever lost in the forest, you got to start a fire, find birch bark. Because even if it's soaking wet, it'll still burn. It's really cool stuff. But if you peel off the bark, the outer layers of it, you can peel off the white papery stuff. But if you peel too deep, it starts to get thicker, and you're starting to peel off some of the phloem and then even the vascular cambium underneath, which could potentially damage the tree. And the thing about the bark is, if you take a tree like this, when you peel off the bark, you peel off a whole section that goes all the way around the tree. So that means you're blocking the flow of nutrients and water this way. Well, mostly the nutrients. The water will still go up the xylem, but the nutrients coming down have a hard time. So you can actually kill the tree by cutting too much around it, around its girth. Okay, so that's the stems for the most part. And of course, there are many different types for arrangements of stems. And then when we get into plant classification, we'll look at that in more detail. All right, we've already covered leaves and flowers, so that's basically the end of the organs of plants. I should mention, though, I mentioned it, but I'm going to write it down. Basically, plants do have systems of organs, and the two systems of a plant are basically the root system, which is underground, and the shoot system, the roots and the shoots. The shoot system is above ground. So above ground and underground. Underground. Two different systems. So unlike animals which have respiratory system and circulatory system and skeletal system and integumentary system and lymphatic system and so on, plants are a little simpler in their layout. And that will be all. We've covered all the organs, so the next thing we'll do in our next video is look at how the organs function to transport the water and the sugars in the plant in a little more detail.